One of his tasks is to tie psychology after Freud back to Kierkegaard. And Freud, as I understand it, conceived of sexuality as the primary motivator in human psychology. I'm wondering if there's maybe a simple way of explaining why that is and how through Kierkegaard, Becker sought to reorient it around death.
Wow.
That's a big question.
No, but you captured, honestly, that brilliant. I think you honestly, basically, I think that Becker's one of the most underappreciated thinkers of the last century because of what he attempted to do. I mean, okay, so trivia point, and that is that when Becker wrote that book, he didn't call it The Denial of Death. It was actually twice the size, and I can't remember the exact title, but the subtitle was something like The Merger of Religion and Science. And Becker's original intention, which comes out a little bit in The Denial of Death, but it was originally the primary focus, is that if you just step back in the Judeo-Christian tradition and look at the development of theological systems of thought, that they run very parallel to the psychodynamic ones, especially if we're willing to talk about, when we're talking about psychoanalysis, we can use the word neurosis. In religious terms, following Tillich and Kierkegaard, he uses the word sin. So that was kind of like the first thing, is that Becker's trying to integrate and synthesize ideas from a variety of disciplines. And he says straight up at the beginning of The Denial of Death that we've got enough truth. The world's choking on truth. And what we need to do is to step back and to recognize ideas that are coming up independently from all of these different disciplinary directions. And then he says that he thinks that Freud is, one of the most important intellectual voices in history. And with all due respect, though, that Freud got it wrong in his insistence that when he argues that the primary motivational impetus of human behavior is sex and aggression. So I taught this stuff at a prison when I first got here. So in the 1980s, I'm at a maximum security prison teaching about Freud. And the prisoners are like, yeah, fighting and fucking. He's got it. Freud's got it. Exactly right. And Freud's argument, though, a lot of people are horrified by psychoanalysis, and they're like, wow, Freud's making this stuff up. But he got that from Darwin. Freud is writing and thinking at the same time that Darwin is doing his thing. And Freud thought that the insistence on sex and aggression being foundational was just a manifestation of Darwin's argument that basically, in order to stay alive, you have to compete in a world of limited resources, hence that aggression may have a biological basis. And then in the long run, it's not whether or not you stay alive, but whether or not your snippets of genetic material persist over time, hence the need to reproduce. And so that was the at least epistemological foundation for starting with sex and aggression. But if you read Freud carefully, he over the decades, he became less and less convinced and got more and more existential. So he writes a book, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and he starts talking about what he calls the death instinct, that we have this natural tendency And this is, again, based on Newton, going towards entropy. And so by the end of his life, it's like it's not so much sex and aggression. It's more about Eros in opposition to Thanatos. And Becker's point is he's like, Freud got very close to acknowledging that what's at stake is ultimately existential concerns about death. But what Becker argues, and there's a chapter about Freud in The Denial of Death, is that Freud himself was terrified of dying, and that his death denial was to inflate himself up to superhuman proportions. And basically, he could never see death anxiety as central to understanding human affairs because he was so afraid of himself dying. And so what Becker insists is that you can take all of the psychoanalytic concepts that are based on sex and aggression, and you can recast them in existential terms to represent efforts to minimize death anxiety. And it's with that in mind that he uses Kierkegaard as an example of existential psychology before existential psychology. And that because Kierkegaard really is all about people being so smart that they become aware of their own existence, at which point in, I can't even remember, the little book that Kierkegaard wrote, doesn't really matter, but where he talks about that awe and dread are the natural result of self-awareness. And it's from there that Becker really moves on to develop his arguments about existential anxieties and the defensive reactions that are engendered thereby.